Thank you, Warwick. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nikolai. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and friendly faces, and it is an honor to be speaking here at the school. This will seem a little bit redundant since I'll go over a little bit of the background of the book, but that's okay, we'll work through it. And I'll talk a little bit about the book and then talk about some larger socio-political issues that the book raises, and in particular talk about forms of resistance to the crisis, to the foreclosure crisis. And in doing so, I hope to turn this into a discussion as soon as possible, because I find that when I am doing these readings and lectures, that the audience has they make a great contribution, whether it's through questions or contentions or anything they want to say. As you can imagine, people have brought a level of passion to this that makes it a fascinating discussion. So here we go. Now, as Warwick said, this book began as an article for Harper's back in 2008. I returned to Tampa in that year, in March of that year, and the article ran in September, late September, the same month that Lehman Brothers collapsed. But by then, I had been working on this story for about 10 years. Essentially, the book began for me back in 1998, when I left the University of Florida with an MFA in fiction. And this is, as some of you know, an infamously impractical degree. But nonetheless, I went out into the world with aspirations to become a novelist. And like many novelists, I did the natural thing and I just moved home. In my case, it was Tampa, where I lived with my father and tried to save money and figure out my next move. So while sending off short stories and collecting rejection letters, I went to work for my father, which was something of a ritual for us since I'd been doing it since I was a kid. His career has always involved construction of one kind or another, whether it's fast food restaurants or houses. And by 1998, he had gotten into foreclosures. Now, I knew what foreclosures were. I didn't know too many of the details. Specifically, what he was doing was trashing out foreclosures. And this involves going into a home that has been foreclosed, cleaning it up, and if the bank needs repairs made or any work done to the house to put it back on the market, he would do that. Now, in 1998, of course, foreclosures occupy a slim margin of an otherwise very robust housing market in both Tampa and across the country. Foreclosures were an anomaly and basically a job that nobody wanted to do. It's just dirty work. And like I said, and he'd been doing it since '92, and so I knew what they were. I just had no idea what the ugly details were all about. Of course, that all changed upon my first foreclosure. And it's still a vivid experience, and I remember that first morning we headed out to tackle various houses on his list. And the first phase of this process involves a list of homes, addresses that he gets from his wife, who is a foreclosure agent. And we check the addresses, we visit the home to see whether or not it's occupied. And if it is occupied, he'll leave Mena, my stepmother, he'll leave her business card, and they'll try and work out some kind of negotiation, cash for keys, or some kind of exit. If it's unoccupied, we enter and document the work ahead by taking pictures. He'll make a list of repairs that need to be made and provide the bank an estimate. So this particular house, my first foreclosure, we could tell it was abandoned. And we walked inside, and there was this aftermath of junk scattered everywhere. X-rays, letters from the court, notices from the sheriff, a greeting card. And the greeting card in particular was signed in this kind of loopy handwriting of a child saying, you know, hang in there, mommy, that sort of thing. Photographs, all kinds of flotsam that I could piece together and tell that somehow this suggested a kind of emotional and psychological unraveling, just by the way it was scattered, the way things seemed to be moved towards as if they were in the process of moving them out of the house and suddenly abandoned them. And in looking at this and moving through these rooms and looking closer, I realized that I was surrounded by the raw material of an intense character study, a character in crisis in particular. And for a writer, for me, as a writer, there was an epiphany. And so I grabbed an empty box and put what I could in it and started collecting as much as I could fit into this box to tell me who this person was and how they'd lost this home. And in doing this, I was aware of this voyeuristic tension in sneaking through and collecting evidence of this family's tragic and humiliating circumstances. And this was obviously an invasion of both privacy and property. But at the same time, it was compounded with this duty to haul all of this stuff to the dump and erase whatever traces of this family were left, to make them basically disappear. So I knew immediately that I had walked into a profoundly important story. The trick for me at that point, the challenge really, the ethical, logistical, and artistic challenge, was to figure out a way to tell this story. Now, having the mindset and the ambitions of a novelist, or as a fiction writer, at that time I considered working it into a novel. And the advantage of that was I would be able to easily protect the identity of the victims. The disadvantage at the same time was that you would lose the impact of truth. You would dilute the emergency just a little. As fiction, the reader would be tempted to ascribe all of the details of the extremities of hardship, the things that I'd found, to my imagination. It may even seem like exaggeration. Now, in trying to figure out the ways in which to tell the story, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, a year after I started doing foreclosures, I moved to New York in about 2000 and found my calling in magazines, as Warwick mentioned. And I began a career as a writer and an editor of literary journalism, long-form narrative journalism. And every now and then I'd bounce this idea of the foreclosure story off of other editors, as a reported piece. But the trouble again was that foreclosures were still in the margins. They were kind of a freak show of real estate. They were far from a crisis. And it was difficult to find the point of telling that story in nonfiction, other than to illustrate how bad life could get for a certain marginalized set of people. Again, in this robust housing market, foreclosures were largely avoidable because whatever circumstances you were in, chances are you could sell the home. They required extraordinary difficulty. Divorce, lack of health insurance, drug addiction, gambling addiction, that sort of thing. And all of these are sad circumstances, but they're particular to each household. They weren't indicative of an epidemic. Foreclosures weren't widespread enough to be relevant to that many people. But as the years pass, the houses stay with me, and every chance I get, I return home to Tampa to work for my father and study and collect information about these victims. And in calling home, I would ask my dad about the houses. I'd say, well, how are the houses? Because there's always some extraordinary anecdote, and I'd ask about them as if they were some kind of eccentric relative off in the Peace Corps or something. And all the while revisiting a way in which to tell this story. And as the years pass, my father's anecdotes become more and more extreme. And he mentions how overwhelmed he is with the sheer number of foreclosures on his list, and how that list keeps growing, and quickly. And then around late 2006, early 2007, we begin noticing headlines in the national papers that warn of economic trouble. And these two sources, both the headlines and what my father's anecdotes that he would share, started to dovetail, so that we realized an epidemic was brewing, and that there was an emergency forming on the ground and working its way up into the larger economy, well beyond real estate. So, 10 years after that first foreclosure, that dilemma was solved. I knew the form of the story, and that form was journalism. So I pitched it to Harper's, and it was a very simple premise. I had no chops as a financial reporter, nor was I interested in competing for access to CEOs or politicians on Wall Street or in Washington. I wasn't really interested in this kind of top-down autopsy of the financial system. Instead, I wanted to tell this more democratic story about the impact of foreclosures on families, on everyday citizens. And I really wanted to get across what I had witnessed in all those years in working them. And because of my personal history and my access to foreclosures, I knew I had an opportunity to tell this story in a way that was unique. And it's funny, in preparing for this talk, I went back over my notebooks that I began keeping that year in the spring of 2008, where I scribbled whatever I came across in other books, books that I was reading to help prepare me to tell this story, in addition to other notes and diagrams of houses and that sort of thing. And in the very beginning of that notebook, there are two quotes that kind of set the tone for this book. And the first one is from James Agee, from Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And as some of you already know, This is the book that he did with Walker Evans with the beautiful photographic prelude documenting the dignity and the struggle of tenant farmers in the South during the Great Depression. And it's a mess of a book. It's a beautiful mess. One that was in, this was in desperate need of an editor. But at the same time, being so unfettered, it's this kind of modernist marvel. And it's a beautiful form of literary activism. And the passage that got my attention that I wrote down is, it's as follows. For in the immediate world, everything is to be discerned for him who can discern it. And centrally and simply, without either dissection into science or digestion into art, but with the whole of consciousness, seeking to perceive it as it stands, so that the aspect of a street in sunlight can roar in the heart of itself as symphony, perhaps as no symphony can. And all of consciousness is shifted from the imagined, the revisive, to the effort to perceive simply the cruel radiance of what is. Now, this is what bits of wisdom from great books do best for a writer. They reinforce this instinct that you have and propel you in a direction you're already inclined to follow. And this idea of capturing the cruel radiance of things articulated how I wanted to render what I'd found, how I wanted to render the impact of the crisis on people I'd never even met. It convinced me how I could render this crisis honestly and viscerally to capture the physical and emotional experience of this job and discovering the foreclosure for that first time. And so the idea was to provide portraits of these houses so that they could work as characters in and of themselves and tell the stories of the people who had abandoned them. And through this opening ritual of detective work, basically what I ended up calling a literary forensics, I was able to humanize the problem and then moved deeper into it so that the objects these people left behind led to the people themselves and then led to others who occupied these various corners of what I recognize as a kind of crisis ecosystem, wherein these various individuals competed, cooperated, and improvised in order to survive. And as the narrative progressed over a couple of years, I continued to find different people to guide me through their particular corners of this ecosystem. Homeowners, whether they be victims or speculators, evicted tenants, mortgage brokers, real estate agents, land developers, sheriffs, neighbors, and activists in particular. And all of them helped me explore these gray areas, like I said, these corners of moral confusion. And one of those corners appears it shows up in the third part of this book, and it deals with the intersection of foreclosures and homelessness. By February 2009, I'd met a fellow named Max Rameau, who had an organization called Take Back the Land. And I was fascinated by the way in which Take Back the Land tackled those two issues, foreclosures and homelessness. What they did basically was seize foreclosures on behalf of homeless families. And the reason it fascinated me was because of this combination of solutions, this humanistic action that was technically illegal. Take Back the Land exposed a fundamental paradox of the American character, which was this collision of principles between our longstanding belief in self-reliance, the mythologizing of the by-the-bootstraps mentality, and the idea that we are a compassionate people. Now, I'll give you some data to set the context here. In 2008, when I arrived in February 2009, by then, the homeless population in America had increased by 20,000 people. 4 in 10 were living either in a car or on a street or somewhere that was not meant for human habitation. The doubled up population increased by 6 million. And by doubled up, we mean people living in other people's basements, whether it's a relative or a friend, people living on couches, that sort of thing. And this is a thorny issue because some of the agencies who track homelessness and who receive funding to tackle homelessness do not consider doubling up a form of homelessness. I think they're gravely mistaken because any form of displacement by way of foreclosure, to me, is an emergency. I think to wait until and attack the problem only at its worst phase allows it to corrode all these other aspects of a social fabric and economic fabric. And the last stat is that by February 2009, in Miami-Dade County, there were 70,000 people on the waiting list for affordable housing. So this was an emergency, and this is how Max and Take Back the Land chose to tackle it. And what this will do is set the context. What I tried to do in this book is focus on Florida, but also pull out and give a sense of what was happening in other places. And so this will set the stage of what was happening with regard to activism across the country. For a while, for a season, there was a sense that a dramatic, galvanized response would form in proportion to the financial crisis itself. The holiday moratorium was lifted, and the recession triggered by the housing market collapse began to work a chokehold across the classes, the pain worsening as it descended toward the poor. And as the purge of homeowners accelerated, a resistance ramped up, driven by anger over the TARP bailout and a fresh story in which the nexus between foreclosures and homelessness began to widen, the emergency of homelessness inching its way up the social ladder, just a little. The resistance evolved from private acts of subterfuge, setting traps of boiling water to burn whoever came to claim a house, or spreading ferret piles across the floor, or just hiding in the attic until the cleanup crew left, to more public acts of civil disobedience. In Philadelphia, in the spring of 2008, a March meeting of the City Council ended with a unanimous resolution that called for a moratorium on foreclosures. It was unenforceable, initially, but became a catalyst when the Philadelphia County Sheriff, John Green, backed it up, canceling the next day's foreclosure auction. Sheriff Green's move wasn't exactly legal, but that technicality got lost in the popular response to it. It took about a day or so for him to become a national personification of resistance, a government employee no less, armed with his own Declaration of Neighborhood Stability and Sheriff Green's important steps to saving your home. What's more, his standoff got results. Just a few days after the moratorium, a pair of circuit court judges huddled with lenders, lawyers, and housing advocates to broker a compromise, a pilot program that included conciliation conferences between lenders and homeowners to help keep people in their homes. It served as a model, but was seldom applied to other courts and other states. Then there was Sheriff Thomas Dart of Chicago, frustrated by the number of completely stunned tenants he and his deputies were kicking out onto the streets, who finally refused to carry out any evictions until the circuit court implemented steps to warn tenants of a landlord's impending foreclosure. Dart ended up sharing the grisly details of his job at a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee in November, where he testified alongside David G. Kittle, chairman of the Mortgage Bankers Association, as part of a hearing on a bill that would give judges the power to adjust home mortgages in bankruptcy. Kittle and Dart were a blunt pairing, but it set the polls. Dart described his many visits to Chicago's Inglewood neighborhood, where during a spate of foreclosures, 16 homes were reduced to 4 after demolition, and 2 of the remaining 4 were boarded up. It's absolute chaos out there, he told the committee. Kittle took a more distant philosophical position, reminding the committee that as part of the natural free cycle, as part of the natural free market cycle, some people just have to fail. Committees, state agencies, hotlines, Hope Now, foreclosure defense lawyers, a hot new market. The institutional responses were ad hoc and arthritic, but there were a handful of real revolutionaries, frustrated by the pomp and circumstance of congressional hearings and the false charity of lawyers. One of them was Max Rameau, a Miami activist whose guerrilla mission was a radical blend of solutions, summed up in an Associated Press article in December of 2008. He is helping homeless people illegally move into foreclosed homes. Rameau called it liberating a home. It was an irresistible story and very simple. Rameau and his organization, Take Back the Land, contended that everyone, no matter what, the new and old faces of homelessness alike, deserved a home. He also considered the surplus of empty, deteriorating foreclosures a gross waste of a precious resource. The misdemeanor of trespassing didn't dissuade him. Trespassing was the point. Rameau wanted the real estate agent, the bank, the cops all to know. And should they decide to try and kick a family out, he wanted that confrontation to be broadcast to the public, hoping to provoke a very public debate over what land rights were in the first place. I tracked him down, studied what stories I could find on him. I brought my father to hear him speak in Sarasota at a small private college, a surreal scene given the wealth and leisure that distinguished this coastal town. And I began to get to know him. In all our conversations, he stressed that Take Back the Land was not a homeless advocacy group. We are not a homeless organization, he said, emphatically. We are not a housing organization. Our issue is land rights and land control, specifically the black community's right to control land in the black community. Homelessness, then, was the issue through which he could address his larger concerns, and foreclosures, in turn, were the occasion for taking a closer look at homelessness. This had been his mission for some time, but it was now in the throes of the crisis that the mission dovetailed neatly with an agitated public. It was as if foreclosures were the crisis Rameau had been waiting for all this time. And he wasn't shy about his mission. He was, in fact, looking for a fight. So I descend to Miami and I meet Ramo, and I figure out how this method works. The strategy of finding homes and liberating them. And there are certain criteria that Ramo and Take Back the Land uses. And he feels bad about it because it in a way, contradicts this idea that everyone deserves a home. But he's also savvy in terms of public relations. He knows that in order to get public support for this, he had to be very specific about the people he helped. And he helped families only. He did not help individuals. He did not house the chronically homeless, nor did he house addicts. And anyone who lived in a home that was liberated by Take Back the Land had to have at least enough of an income to pay for utilities. They had to at least sustain themselves in this home. And what this brings up is the idea that it sort of reminds us of the sort of fungible definition of homelessness. A lot of these people were just the working poor who had been caught up in this crisis. And to assist them, to keep things cheap, they would have solar panels donated, and they'd attach them to the roof of the home. And they would work with what they had under these conditions of what was habitable. His track record, by the time I visited him, 7 families had been housed by Take Back the Land. And of those 7, 2 were forced out by realtors and the cops. One family quit the house for fear of confronting these same forces. One family stayed for 6 months and moved on to live on an organic farm in the Panhandle. And 2 more families saved enough to move on. So there was some success. There was a pretty good track record. And so Max takes me scouting. We visit several homes, and we find a few, and most of them are too abused, they're too vandalized, they're too gutted for his purposes. And he explained to me the techniques of arranging these showdowns, wherein once a family's moved in, if the family agrees, they use that circumstance and that family in that particular house to stage a confrontation. They'll call the real estate agent, they'll call the police, they'll call the local news media, local television. And everyone will show up on that front lawn, and they'll have this showdown that raises this issue. And this is why it's important to have a kind of ideal poster family. And in fact, before I'd arrived, the family that became the public face of Take Back the Land was a single mother of 3. She was from Haiti, and she was getting her PhD in sociology. And she was just down on her luck, and she needed a hand, and eventually she burned out, so he lost his public face. But by the end of the week that I was there, he happened to meet this family called the Trody family. And this became the most famous of Take Back the Land's families. But it was also the most problematic. There were 12 people in this family who were living in about a 1,200 square foot home, about 3 generations of people. By the time they met Max, they were living in a bread truck. We went to see the house. In fact, he called me from the house, and we went and checked it out. And the home was a wreck. It was fit for demolition. There was plywood on the floor. I mean, there were no carpet. It was only plywood. The floors had been stripped of plywood. Glass, food, that sort of thing. And it was a bit problematic because in most cases, when Take Back the Land liberates a home, it has been abandoned by or taken from and then subsequently vandalized by strangers. So it's easy for him to say, by bringing this family in, we're saving the neighborhood. The problem with this particular home is that no one other than the family itself were responsible for the house's demise. And they were basically living in squalor with young children. And so the question became, what would happen when all these cameras began to show up? It turns out that at the same time, Michael Moore's film crew was in town. They'd heard about Max. He was filming Capitalism, a Love Story, and the family makes it into that film. So this was going to be his most publicized showdown to date, and it was the most problematic family to date. And it fascinated me because, and I guess I got lucky in being there at this time, because in studying the ethics of this crisis, the Trody's decisions and responsibilities, and some would say their irresponsibility, added another layer to what was already a complicated problem. But nonetheless, Max moved forward with it. And Monday morning, 30 people, 30 supporters and activists show up to this home. And there's about half a dozen cameras from every local news station, including the Spanish language channels. Moore's crew has been there filming him, getting as much footage as they can. The cops are on the way, And I'm going to read to you a scene that I think articulates all of these issues. And this is basically that showdown on this front lawn, where by Monday morning, the Take Back the Land had moved the family back in. The furniture was back in. People were outside with these signs. The camera crews were there. And in reading this scene, I'm going to have to warn you. It's a confrontation. So it's a bit dramatic. To pull up my glasses for this one. You know, and in writing this with such fidelity to character, I try to render them as honestly as possible to make this as novelistic as possible. So we're probably going to see the most dramatic reading at the Clinton School to date. So forgive me if this seems over the top, but hopefully it'll be effective. Friday's eviction had been carried out with the help of a foreclosure services company called Velozic Enterprises, a crew of about 3 men, including Chris Velozic, the company's owner, who was trim and tan and white-haired, wearing a company t-shirt, specializing in foreclosure services. As he and his crews arrived that afternoon, I could see the bulge of a pistol holder underneath his t-shirt. He was returning to Conley's house, and I should pause. Carolyn Conley is the grandmother of the family. She's the matriarch, and she's the most outspoken one of them all. And there's a way in which she started to kind of play the victim and really play up to the cameras. Mia is one of the adult daughters in this situation, and those I think you'll be able to figure out who the rest are. He was returning to Conley's house to recover whatever furniture had been left behind after Friday's eviction and haul it off to the dump. He'd been backed up all weekend and couldn't get around to it until now, when he pulled up with the truck and trailer to find a couple dozen people gathered in Conley's front yard, the furniture back inside. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. He simply walked up to the door, a clipboard tucked in his arm, surveyed the crowd, then told everyone it was time to go. Max appeared, walking up to the stoop. He insisted Velozic reconsider. Velozic clasped his hands near his belt buckle, nodded. "Let me tell you something," he said to Ramon. "The bank offered them, the realtor offered them, $2,000 to give them money to rent a place. They said no. Right now they're living in a truck," Max said. "This place is empty. There's an empty house over there, which is in much better condition. That house is going to sell way before this one." "That's not my problem, sir. If the bank permits you to go inside, the bank isn't making any money by this unit staying empty," Max said, "and this family being homeless. They're not making any money. So call them and let them know what the humanitarian thing to do is." Of course, Velozic had about as good a chance of reaching someone at the bank as Rameau did, but he didn't bother clarifying this point. "I work for the bank," he said. "They tell me to do the job. If I don't do it, they'll find somebody else to do it." "May I say something?" one woman asked, and began pointing out the value of empty houses and their depreciative effect on a neighborhood. It triggered a dozen points people had been ready to make all morning, and Velozic, with his hands clasped in front of him, tried to counter each one, a free market logic countering the humanitarian logic of the crowd. The tension thickened. Finally, Mia, Trody's daughter, boiled over. "You're the bank," she shouted. "It's not right that she's been in this house for 22 years and y'all are going to put her out. It's not right. And you come in here saying that we're trespassing? We should be telling you that you're trespassing, because this is our house. All this stuff that's going on in this house, you don't know what's going on in this house. She brought us up in this house." "I got a question," one man said. "Where is the money the federal government put in the banks? Where is that money?" "Why don't you ask Obama?" Velozic said. He'd lost his poise. The crowd howled at him. "I'm asking you because you represent the bank. Where is the money Obama or whatever put in the hands of the bank?" Velozic kept quiet. "You cannot answer? Ask the bank," he said. They howled again. "You're the bank," Mia said. "That's what you said. So why are you here representing the bank if you can't even answer the question?" "The bank wants the property back," Velozic said. "Want it back for what? For it to sit on the block? For what? They're going to come here, they're going to tear out the frames, tear out the windows, and it's going to be a piece of dust before tomorrow. Talking about you want the house back. For what? It's sitting here empty. Do you have a heart? Think about it. Do you have a heart? Kids got nowhere to go, and you're sitting here telling us the bank wants this property back. To sit here empty, this house, and with the houses down the street, and the one over there." Conley struggled forward toward the stoop. "Do you know who God is? Do you go to church? Answer me." "Sure," Velozic said. "You believe in God, do you? Does the bank believe in God?" "Who financed this house for you?" Velozic asked her. "Option 1, she said. "Have you spoken to them? What have they told you?" I've done everything I can, Conley said. Did you respond to their letters? I've done everything I can. Okay, what did you offer them, and what did they offer you? I tried to do a reverse mortgage, Mia shouted. She was ripped off. It was a predatory lender. She got ripped off. I had people come in here and say they were going to do a reverse mortgage, Conley said. I was all for that. I signed papers. They tell me everything is fine. They tell me I can live here for the rest of my life, just pay the taxes. The next thing I get is these foreclosure notices. What kind of deal is that? Get out from behind your desk and come out here and talk to the people. She was talking to the cameras now. And did they? Volosik asked her. Did they make arrangements? They didn't make nothing with her, Mia said. This is what I'm telling you. This is why when the foreclosure notices came, everybody was sitting there in shock. Conley sighed. I know I can't read and write good, she said, subdued now. Come on, I know my education. And I'm finding out now that people are out here trying to take advantage of people. I don't have a choice, Volosik said. He pulled out his cell phone and called the police. The crowd launched into a chant. In a fundamental way, this showdown on 137th Street was a crossroads moment, a knotting together of disparate philosophies, economics and ethics, culpability and forgiveness, merit and charity. There was a battle line, and where you stood suggested the American principle you believed in. In the air were arguments for both the meritocrats and the bleeding hearts. The problem was that if you agreed with the meritocratic principles, you came up short with an appropriate fate for those who failed or refused to do their part. Was homelessness a fitting punishment? Starvation on the street? Reporters followed Volosik as he walked away from the stoop and back to his truck. And once he'd put a few tools away, since his job would be on hold for a while, he took a few questions, hands clasped by his buckle, very cool-headed, trying to clarify the bank's position, though he only seemed to reinforce Rameau's point. The bank doesn't want these houses, he said to us. I want you to understand that. They don't want the houses. They want people to pay. They're in the business to sell houses and to get money from the principal and interest, but people don't want to pay. When it comes to this point, he said, nodding at the action on the lawn, it's been many, many, many months. The bank offered them $2,000. With $2,000, you can go and rent a place. How many houses have you trashed out? I asked him. Thousands, he said. I've done about 600 or 700 evictions this last year. I go anywhere in Miami-Dade County. How long have you been at it? About 3 years, he said. What were you doing before that? I invested in real estate. Now, I just let that one sit. You know, that's the end of that scene, and just enjoying the irony of it. And I cannot express to you how lucky I felt to be there in this position, in this moment where all of this action is happening on the lawn, where these people are sort of roiling over this issue. And we're talking to Volosik, and the cameras are just looking for B-roll, really. And everything falls into place. You have the ethical positions, you have Volosik talking to us, and you have the entire ecosystem at work. You have these people cooperating, working against each other, competing, and improvising. And all of this was proven right there, especially with Volosik, who basically had evolved from investor to scavenger. And it was one of those happy accidents that you always should be open to, I guess, as a journalist, to sort of see when it happens and run with it. But again, ultimately, we come up against this question of a fitting punishment. And as impartial as I tried to be, and as non-didactic, and for all the problems inherent in seeing the Trodies as pure victims, I could not help but indulge in really what's only a human response, which is to sympathize. And which brings me to the second quote from my notebooks, which is from Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. And as some of you may know, Zinn was an activist historian who believed that historians, writers, journalists cannot, nor should they, be neutral in covering events. That they had a moral duty to be honest participants, and if not participants, then at least honest observers who are covering events through a particular set of values. And he has this very simple philosophy. He writes, in a world of conflict, in a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people not to be on the side of the executioners. Now, Zinn was writing metaphorically against the powers of oppression in labor and class, and especially war. And in the case of foreclosures in 2008, it was difficult to draw that line between the victims and the oppressors, since in addition to all the corporate corruption and political malfeasance we've discovered since, and knew about to a certain degree at the time, So many citizens from different walks of life shared a portion of the blame. And the housing bubble and crash had such an egalitarian breadth of willing participants and unwitting victims that it revealed not only the faulty parts of this economic machine, but that an entire zeitgeist was completely delusional. But I think now at this point, any idea of punishing this irrational exuberance really doesn't, it's lost its place in the current debate over what to do. At this point, the crisis, as many of us know, has devolved so that foreclosures are more a symptom of unemployment than any form of irresponsibility. And the statistics reveal this. In 2010, there were 3 million households received a foreclosure filing, whether it was 30 days, 60 days, or a 90-day notice. Also in 2010, there were 1 million repossessions of homes by banks and lenders. Now what this means is that 2010 was the worst year of the crisis since the whole thing began, even though the Great Recession is officially over and the recovery has technically begun. And now in addition to this, there are hundreds of thousands of homes that are part of the shadow inventory. And if you don't know, the shadow inventory is the part of the foreclosure process where it's homes that are 90 days overdue, but also homes that haven't made it off the books yet, homes that haven't made it back onto the market. They're just sitting there in limbo. And a good portion of these are bank walkaways, in which cases the bank, having mailed the foreclosure notice to the homeowner, and in many cases the homeowner leaving the home, assuming they're going to be evicted, in many cases the bank sees that it doesn't want the home, it does the math and realizes there's nothing to make on it, that the value of the home, they'll never make their money back. So they return ownership, they cease the foreclosure process. And meanwhile, the homeowner has no idea. And so you have a lot of these houses deteriorating and bringing blight to neighborhoods, depreciating these neighborhoods, collecting code enforcement violations. And it's neither the bank's responsibility, and the homeowner in whose name it is completely ignorant of the circumstances. Now, given this rate of repossession and the number of houses that remain in this shadow market, you begin to realize just how far we have to go before we find a solution. And I think as the autopsy progresses and the economy continues to be bifurcated, heading in this bifurcated direction between the rich and the poor, and the distance between them increasing, we will continue to see this kind of splintering that's documented in this book between principles. And I think that this splintering kind of makes the free market democracy, it puts it at risk. Because what we'll be doing is finding ourselves choosing between ideas of fiduciary duty and humanistic principles. Between the idea that a contract is binding and that one's integrity is at stake in honoring it and feeding your family or even housing your family. It even comes down to whether we respect the law or suspect that law enforcement is an unwitting accomplice in the illegal seizure of a home. Now, the upshot of this is that with every crisis, as is documented here and as we're seeing in the news, you have lots of improvisational actions happening on the street, lots of improvisational solutions as a matter of survival, whether it's from activists or homeowner defense groups, and even lawyers. And lately, in Massachusetts, New York, and Florida, judges have been stepping in. And they've been doing, for the most part, despite the rocket docket scandal, a pretty good job of taking the banks to task for their sloppy rush to try and extract as much money as possible from the securitization of these mortgages. And then when they're toxic, sort of washing their hands of them. You know, all at the risk of families. Now at this point, I know I'm going on and I want to again return this to a kind of a discussion, more of a dialogue with you. I'd like to open it up and see if you have any questions or any disagreements with the points that I've made. So thank you for hearing me out. So.
Thank you, Paul. That was the most traumatic reading that we've had.
The echo startled me.
If you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Right there.
Thank you for coming, by the way. About 20 years ago in Houston, there was a similar foreclosure market. Probably not as extensive as 2010. But do you draw any parallels from Houston, even if you go to California, and the equity market in homes just plummeted during that time.
Do you mean, are there any parallels in terms of the severity, or what the effects on communities, or?
It just seems that that market was almost identical to this market.
Right. You know, the funny thing, when I mentioned 1998, I mentioned the extremities, where divorce, there's addiction, that sort of thing. And the strange thing about now is that, you know, the same set of circumstances, especially with widespread unemployment, the dangerous thing is because the housing market has bottomed out, which it has done before, it has done so universally, so that all of those extreme circumstances, divorce, unemployment, lack of health insurance, and this is, I mean, talk about an issue that's going to blow up. I mean, that's brewing. There is no last resort. I mean, in those cases, I mean, even when the housing market tanked, there were certain aspects of the economy that, of course, you could rely on to sort of pull us out of it. But again, and this seems like stating the obvious, it's so widespread and so fundamental that while there may be parallels, I don't think it's an exaggeration at this point that it is the worst crisis since the Great Depression. And it's funny, in mentioning that, there was I had thought that there would be a quicker jump to hyperbole for people to jump on that wagon and make that comparison. And the great thing, one of the greatest assets I had in doing this, which I learned from another writer, was to take advantage of the tools that Google offers. So I guess in some ways this is a plug for Google. But they have ways in which you can track instances and mentions of certain phrases. And in fact, when you look at their news tab, you can look at mentions of the Great Depression, and they have a timeline. And interestingly enough, you could see where it peaked and where it spiked, and it really wasn't until things really devolved into an emergency state that people started making those comparisons. And I think it was when Obama finally made that. It was a press conference, I believe, and when the president, with all the powers at his disposal, makes that comparison, I guess it becomes official. So yeah, I mean, obviously there are parallels, but in other ways it is obviously unprecedented. I don't know if there's anything we can learn from it, from the previous crashes. And it doesn't seem like we've learned much in the meantime.
Right here.
So on the news media, you hear a lot of discussions about why all these houses became foreclosed all over the country, and some people say it's, people got in over their heads, or they, there's bad loans to begin with. And it seems like a lot of times on the right, you hear people discussing that in the 80s and the 70s, there was a big push to give loans to people that really shouldn't have had them any time to begin with. I mean, they just started to lower their standards for who deserved to get loans. And I was wondering if you saw any evidence of that, or if you saw a different reason why the number of loans or the number of foreclosures happened, or if you thought that there's any credence at all to that argument that.
Sure, I mean, it was a good idea. Expanding home ownership was a good idea because it contributes to the tax base, it brings in revenue. The securitization of mortgages isn't necessarily an evil thing because it allowed these companies, it allowed Fannie and Freddie to issue more mortgages, to bring more people into the, and look, this is thatched together with this cultural idea of the American dream. So it's just one of those things that with this combination of trends, eventually just ran amok. So it isn't necessarily Jimmy Carter's fault that we're in this mess. It isn't necessarily, although they're very poorly run, and they're a huge contribution to this mess. It isn't necessarily exclusively the fault of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. But it is, again, the combination of the discovery of what you could do with the securitization of mortgages and the fact that these people were given people who maybe shouldn't have had the opportunity to own a home were given that opportunity to own a home. But the funny thing is that in looking at this, because of how widespread it is, it's very difficult to look at the individual circumstances. And what interested me, and when I tried to research as best I could, but again, it's so specific that you'd have to just get lucky and land on these people, a lot of whom disappeared, are those circumstances in which someone who was just riding the line between it being a safe bet, home ownership being a safe bet, and just barely being able to hang on, was given an opportunity to hang on. And in fact, I meet a real estate agent in this book, and we discuss that because his whole obsession is looking through this paperwork and looking at the numbers and trying to put together kind of detective work of people's motives through the numbers and whether they refinanced or double closed and that sort of thing. And ultimately, though yes, there has been widespread abuse of this system, there were those circumstances where someone was just riding that line and wanted an opportunity to own a home because they'd been convinced, as many of these people were convinced, that that was part of being a good citizen. And if these people are already treading water, it's one of those things where it's one of the dominoes waiting to be knocked over. At the same time, we talk about the fact that people refinance their homes and second mortgages, and they sort of splurged and paid off their credit cards. But, if you're treading water, again, and you're part of a struggling middle class, and you have a credit card that's got $10,000 on it at 26% interest, and you can refinance your home at 5% interest, why isn't that just smart money management? These people have no idea that the market's going to fall out from under, be pulled out from under them. So, yeah, I think that is part of it, but the majority of it is just, again, people talked about it. It's kind of a cliche, but it was that perfect storm, and that was one of the pieces that had to be in place.
There was an article, I think either this week or late last week, talking about the foreclosure crisis, if you will, spreading to what they thought were more stable
cities. Yeah.
Stable cities. So is this still, 2011, 12, 13, to where it's just kind of going to continue to spread?
I suppose NPR says today that the analysts and economists say that 2011 will be the peak of foreclosure activity. I suppose it depends. Prognostication is it's one of those things that irritated me about following this. It's amazing the living that pundits can make just sort of going on television and being wrong.
You don't have to be right.
Yeah, there's a short-term memory that allows their survival. Yeah, obviously with all these houses that are in this shadow inventory, with the number of people who are displaced, it's not going to be solved anytime soon. We know that much. It's too bad that we've gotten to this point, because I think there was a real opportunity for the banks to do what made financial sense and consider this kind of nuclear option of debt forgiveness or principal reduction, because we know they don't save any money by foreclosing. It costs $40,000 to $60,000 per home to foreclose, on top of the debt that's already incurred by what is owed. So they're not going to make any money in this market by kicking that family out. And for as much as people talk about unemployment and how the lack of mobility affects unemployment, people not being able to take a job in another city or another state because they can't sell their home in an underwater market. Displacement is also a factor that affects unemployment, the job market. It's a very traumatic event, and it's harder to quantify, but it certainly is a factor. So. Yes, sir.
What is your view toward the current thinking of winding down, at least harnessing back, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, which were a part of the overall problem with feeding money into the system and the bankers going out and doing it all again?
I guess it remains to be seen, and I've been following that as closely as I can from both sides. And it's extremely complicated. I have to admit, I'm not an economist. Dialing back, I guess, the degree to which they back these loans is, I think, a good idea. The scary thing, I think, is, well, not scary, but what concerns me is that, well, two parts to that. At the same time, it's obvious that banks will be more stringent in determining who's going to qualify for a home mortgage. And the lending standards will return to what they were, to sound lending standards. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll get to the point where banking returns to the kind of personal relationships that once distinguished banking. But at least lending standards will be tightened up and safer. The problem is, this seems to be changing a little bit now, but with that in place, the banks aren't lending. I mean, so many people I spoke with and interviewed, homeowners, potential homeowners and mortgage brokers, were expressing so much frustration with the fact that the banks just weren't giving out the money. And these were people with 750 credit scores. I mean, these were people who wanted to take advantage of the down part of the cycle, who wanted to participate in this classic formula of real estate. But for some reason, the banks just were too skittish. So it's probably good to wind them down and return it to some form of just a smaller market. Maybe 67%, what was it, 67% home ownership. Maybe that was too high for this country. At the same time, you have these debates over the obsession for ownership to begin with, whether some people just should be renting. I don't know if I should be a homeowner. It's certainly more trouble than I anticipated. But,
Ready?
I'm having trouble formulating a question, so I'm going to describe this scenario, and then
Okay.
maybe a question will come. But a young couple, they save their money, and they get enough for a down payment for a house, and they get the house and the mortgage, and they raise a family, and then the kids are gone, and it's time to sell the home. Why do we keep selling these homes back to the bank instead of keeping that wealth inside that family?
you mean why bother trying to sell it in the first place?
Yeah, instead of just keeping it, because you've already paid for it. The family does own it.
They own it outright?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. That's a very specific set of, maybe they just can't afford to pay the taxes on the home. Depends on the value of the home and where it is. Maybe they don't want to be burdened if they're moving. You said they're moving to another city?
No, I'm just saying that, they have this 3-bedroom home, let's say, or 4-bedroom home, and all the kids are gone, and they're sitting around 75 years old, and they don't need 4 bedrooms in the dining room. It's just too much of a house.
Yeah.
So they sell it instead of the family keeping the ownership of that home,
Right.
because it's already been paid for.
Right. Well, I'm sure there's a number of personal issues that, there seem to be sentimental issues at play that we have to consider and not look at it just economically. But I tell you that you mentioned that, and it reminds me of, we talk about this ecosystem and this improvisation, how crisis brings out innovation. And a couple of things that are happening is that some people, in order to hang on to their homes in Florida and Los Angeles, are reintroducing this long-standing tradition of taking in boarders. Which is something that was pretty common up until the 1960s. And so they'll interview their tenants, their soon-to-be roommates, and they'll make it a happy home again, and eventually all get to know each other. But that's an interesting way for these people to kind of hang on, and in those cases, those are people who are still paying. They don't own it outright. They're still paying mortgages, and they're just trying to find a way to avoid foreclosure. And the other interesting thing is that they're trying to figure out what to do with McMansions out in California, and I think in Los Angeles they started issuing them. They're using McMansions as Section 8 housing. So they're turning those McMansions into multifamily housing. And good for them. Why not?
We got time for one more.
Well, you mentioned that now, the higher-end housing, and a lot of people were investing in housing because the continual increase in the price of the house, so they wanted to get in on that. And a lot of the foreclosures now are a result of houses being underwater and people walking away from them because not a good investment anymore.
Right.
So it's really, those are people who are making investment decisions rather than people who are being forced out of their houses because of unemployment.
Yeah. Look, I don't necessarily think, it's not necessarily, I don't think that's right. But I can understand. I can sympathize, because here you have a circumstance where everything is in upheaval. We're totally trying to recalibrate our attitude towards homeownership. We see that on the other end of it, the banks just the behavior of the banks, just to put it in the simplest way, they're not setting a good example. There's a lot of manipulation of these securitized mortgages. It's breeding this kind of contempt for the system, so to speak. And at the same time, we have to remember that regardless of what these, however much these people love their homes, our relationship with the home is radically different than it was, 30, 25 years ago, just because of that job market. I mean, we're lucky if we're going to stay in the same city for more than, or keep the same job for that matter, for more than 5 to 7 years. So there really isn't that much opportunity to develop that kind of sentimentality that might affect one's decision to walk away. And that's just the nature of the economy.
Well, you can see why it's had such good reviews. Oh, one more? Okay.
It seems to me that, I think it was 1996 when there was a tax law change where you could, like a couple could sell a house if they'd lived in it for 2 years and not have to pay capital gains on X $100,000 of profit. You know, there was a change. It used to be you could only sell a house and get an exemption from capital gains once when you were over 55. And then, but it changed with the tax laws. You would know that. Am I right? Okay, and that was, to me, no one ever remarks on this, but it seems to me like that was where the sea change began. Because up until, that was when people would start thinking that, you know, instead of the house as, you know, a place to live, and maybe I want a bigger one or a better one, but, you know, it's a place to live. Now suddenly it was like a leverageable, tradable asset.
It was an asset, yeah.
And, you know, as was expected, one of the ideas behind this tax change is that people would move, like older people who wanted to downsize, will be motivated to move because of this tax exemption. So it unlocked a whole lot of economic activity, like, you know, construction and home decorating and appliances and all that stuff. But it also unleashed this other monster.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And yeah, thank you for making it.
Well, Paul, we are over here signing copies of the book, and you should definitely read it if you haven't already. Thank you again, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you.